I'm going to talk about work that we've done over quite a few years, a lot of which on blue water, and these are my collaborators, Carlo in Rome and Miguel Morales in Livermore. Why study dense hydrogen? Well, you know, there's three principal reasons. First of all, there's lots of applications. The giant planets is one thing that's very important, or exoplanets, fusion, and lately high temperature superconductivity. We're interested in the fundamental physics, namely, you know, it's the first element. Let's find out what happens at high temperatures and pressures under extreme conditions. And the third reason is that it's really a good benchmark for simulation. We want to see how close we can get to nature with simulation without having adjustable parameters. And, well, because I'm trying to rush through this is a phase diagram, conceptual on a kind of an astrophysical scale. Density or pressure along here, this density and pressure, and temperature along here on a log scale. So what you're familiar with in a laboratory is down here at low temperatures and pressure, but it's been a long goal of high pressure physics to find out what happens to hydrogen. When does the molecular bond break, and what phases it can go into? And it's not really known. Maybe I'll skip some of the types of phases that can occur. But here is the experimental access to the phase diagram. There's a very innovative technique called diamond anvil cells, where they can take two diamonds and a small apparatus and get up to more than 1 million atmospheres pressure. But eventually the diamonds do break. And also they break if you heat them up. So to get above 1,000 degrees becomes difficult. Of course, you know, experimentalists are clever and they can get a little bit further. The other technique is what's called shock wave, is that if you take a cell of hydrogen and shoot a bullet through it, you generate a shock wave, and in that tens of nanoseconds, the shock wave going through, you essentially can do an experiment. But with the shock wave, you're constrained to be on this line here, and you see there's a lot of the phase diagram outside of the line, and also you only have 10 nanoseconds to do your experiment, and there are a lot of questions you can't really probe. But if you would drill a hole in Jupiter and Saturn and start at the surface, you'd start out here. You would go inside here. And so if you want to understand, you know, most of those planets and also all the exoplanets, you need to know what's going on in this region up here, which is outside the range of experiment. And, you know, so that's why we do simulations. I mean, we heard about that this morning, is, you know, there's been a whole sequence of better and better simulation methods. And so I'm going to describe what we started about 20 years ago, quantum Monte Carlo, which is really the best technique. What is quantum Monte Carlo? In a word, it's a direct simulation approach to study quantum mechanical systems. That is, we consider hydrogen as in electrons and in protons and put them in a box, and we develop rules of moving the electrons and protons around so that they get the quantum properties correct. And there are some approximations that come in here. There's a whole list of different types of quantum Monte Carlo methods that we use. For example, path integral methods, but I'm going to talk about this coupled electron-ion Monte Carlo, which enables us to study a very interesting part of the phase diagram. Here's the same phase diagram. And initially, when we were doing this a long time ago, we were doing zero temperature diffusion Monte Carlo. And then we started out working at high temperature doing path integral Monte Carlo. But they were kind of limited in the part of the phase diagram, but this part we can study with coupled electron-ion Monte Carlo. And the basic idea is that we have two different Monte Carlos going on simultaneously. Well, not really simultaneously, more sequentially. The ions, the protons, make Monte Carlo move, and then they have to decide whether that increase the energy or decrease the energy. So they spawn a process where we solve for the electronic energy. And then they feed back the results to the protons, and then the protons, go forward and move. But you see that here's one of the ways that you can use parallelism. There's quite a few different ways in this method, so that we're able to use blue waters very effectively. But basically, we have to cancel out the noise coming from the electronic energy. And there's a method that we invented to do this called the penalty method, so that the noise here doesn't bias the results here. So I'm going to talk about a recent result where there's been a lot of theoretical and experimental interest in the last couple of years, and that's called the liquid-liquid transition. You see, this is the normal liquid-liquid transition in hydrogen in a laboratory. If you get a bottle of liquid hydrogen, you're down here. This line would not have to be here, but it's characterized by liquid hydrogen on one side, liquid molecular hydrogen on one side, and liquid atomic hydrogen on the other side. So it's a transition from an insulating liquid to a metallic liquid. And this was proposed in 1944 by Zeldovich and Landau. They said that in this kind of situation, there should be a transition with a discontinuous change in conductivity, volume, and other properties. But the calculations since then have been all over the map. That this is a part of the phase diagram of pressure and temperature, and you see all these different estimates were made with what's called a chemical model, where you assume that the system contained of molecules and atoms and free electrons and so forth. And you try to write a free energy functional, but it's really hard to do that. A simulation is really a much more accurate way where you consider the constituent particles, just the electrons and protons. And in fact, a lot of people do the calculations with density functional theory. That's considered a high level of theory. But you see, the problem with density functional theory is that there's dozens of different functionals that people use. For example, PBE is one functional, or LDA is another functional, or HSC. And here are the different predictions about where you get this liquid-liquid transition. You see they differ by a factor of 2 or 3. So in 2010, this was before Blue Waters, we actually predicted that the transition, this little plateau here is our prediction of where the transition occurs. And I think for the first time we made reliable calculations of where liquid hydrogen goes from a molecular to an atomic phase. And what's shown here are 3 different calculations using density functional theory and using quantum Monte Carlo, and they all show the plateau, albeit at different densities and pressures. That sort of stimulated a lot of experimental interest at Sandia and Harvard and other places. But unfortunately, the experimental results do not agree at all. Here is the result of a shock experiment of where this liquid-liquid transition is. These are our calculations here using quantum Monte Carlo. And here is the results of a diamond anvil study at Harvard over here. So they differ by more than a factor of 2, the experimental results. So it's not a question of us using a simulation to validate experiment at this stage. And then we had our moment of glory last summer when a third experiment came by. This one was from Livermore. And my grandsons were quite delighted that I was involved with an experiment that used 168 giant lasers. This is NIF at Lawrence Livermore Lab. And this was the article in the New York Times that came out in last August. So here is the result of this paper published in Science by Peter Selliers and his group at Livermore. Here, the new measurements are these black dots here, and our calculations are this green dashed line. And so you see that actually simulation has been validated by this experiment. And we've gone further than that, and they and we together have explained why these other experiments have problems. In particular, we are looking at the detailed properties, and this is work that we've done in the last year on blue waters. Well, this shows you how the properties are changing as we go across the transition. First of all, the density, there's a very weak density discontinuity, and here shows the molecular character changing from molecular state to an atomic state. The blue dashed line here is the transition that we've identified, and over here we have the conductivity, and I'll say more about this in a minute, that's showing a jump in the conductivity across the transition, and here shows the character of the electronic state going from a localized state to a delocalized state. So, you can ask, well, what happens at the transition? Is a molecular insulator or a metallic conducting? And the answer is it's both of those things. Both happen together, and one causes the other in the first order of transition. Now, what we've done quite recently on blue waters is looking at the optical properties, because the way these transitions are measured is by shining laser in this. Well, in a diamond anvil, you can shine a laser through the diamonds. And this shock experiment that was done at Livermore, you shine lasers in the shock front. And we've identified, and the colors show the different temperatures that either the experiment, our calculations were done at, from 900 Kelvin to 5,000 Kelvin. And this shows, well, actually the blue lines show the transition at 1500 Kelvin, and the red line show the transition at 900 Kelvin. And what's shown here is the absorption of photons in the laser beams and the reflectivity, which is what they measure optically. They measure the reflectance of the laser and the absorption of the laser. And so finally, here's plotting those lines on the phase diagram. I should say the red and blue here now refer to deuterium and hydrogen because experiments have been done with both isotopes. And we see that these experiments, for example, the Harvard experiment, they put the phase line in the wrong place because they were looking at the absorption signal instead of the reflectance signal. And similarly on the Sandia experiment, we think that basically they overestimated the temperature of their sample, and their points should be down here. There's still a lot of debate about that, I should say. Okay, I still have 2 minutes. Okay. There's been a lot of excitement in the field now. We made a prediction a few years ago that this whole phase diagram of hydrogen should be a superconductor. It'll be the first genuinely room temperature superconductor. In the last couple of years, people have predicted and then discovered superconductivity in lanthanum hydride and hydrogen sulfide at temperatures close to room temperature, but at high pressure. So there's a lot of activity trying to find the exact right combination of materials to make a room temperature superconductor, which is also not at 1 megabar, but maybe at lower pressures. And so we want to learn how to use QMC to enable calculations at longer timescales. And one of the things that we did on blue waters is to explore different DFT functionals. This shows you the quality of different functionals like LDA, PP, van der Waals functionals. So you see this is this is the error in that functional using our configurations that we get from quantum Monte Carlo. And we see that, as a function of pressure, the van der Waals functionals do a whole lot better. So just to wrap up, what our vision of the future now, we want to go to longer length scales and deal with more complex materials. And so we're generating a database of forces and energies for hydrogen and related compounds that we can actually use to develop effective potentials that will work over, that we can do simulations of phase transitions and superconductivity and different things. And so the idea is to have QMC do the hard work of finding accurate energies and forces from microscopic samples, and then use ideas coming from artificial intelligence and neural networks to build effective models at longer length and time scales. And so anyway, this is what we're working on, and there'll be a lot of work for exascale to generate these databases that we'll need to learn these models. So I'll stop there.